decisions that led to unimaginable horrors. Let's begin. It started innocently enough. Ethan had just moved to a new town for work, a small and unassuming community nestled between the forest and an endless stretch of farmland. Everything about it seemed quiet, almost too quiet. His new apartment was affordable, but the landlord had been strangely evasive about its history. Ethan didn't care. He was just happy to have a place to call home. On his second night, as he lay on the worn-out couch scrolling through his phone, he heard it, a faint knock on the window. He froze. His apartment was on the second floor, and the only thing outside that window was a fire escape. His heart raced as he slowly approached, his footsteps creaking on the old wooden floorboards. Peering through the blinds, he saw nothing but the faint glow of the streetlight and an empty alley below. He laughed nervously to himself, convincing his racing mind it was just the wind. But deep down, he knew the wind didn't knock. The next day, the whispers started. Ethan thought he was losing his mind at first, hearing faint voices when no one was around. They were muffled, unintelligible, like they were speaking from another room or another time. Every time he tried to track the source, the voices would stop. The worst was when he swore he heard his own name whispered, just as he was drifting off to sleep. Ethan's co-worker, Mia, noticed his lack of sleep. "You okay?" she asked during a coffee break. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He laughed it off, not wanting to sound paranoid, but Mia wasn't joking. Her face turned serious. "Be careful. That apartment complex, it's got a reputation. People say weird stuff happens there." That night, Ethan decided to stay up late, armed with coffee and his phone, determined to catch whatever or whoever was behind the strange events. Midnight came and went, and just as he began to feel foolish, a loud crash echoed through the apartment. His breath caught as he crept toward the source of the noise, the bathroom. The mirror had fallen off the wall, shards of glass scattered everywhere. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Written in the condensation on the mirror was a single word: leave. The lights flickered as a deep chill filled the room. Ethan's reflection seemed to linger a second too long as he turned away, his shadow on the wall moving even though he was standing still. He grabbed his phone, ready to call Mia or anyone when the screen lit up. He hadn't touched it. A message appeared. No number, no sender, just 2 words: too late. Ethan's breathing quickened as he bolted out of the bathroom, every instinct screaming at him to leave the apartment. But as he reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. The lock turned, but the door didn't move. Then behind him, the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the kitchen. He couldn't bring himself to turn around. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and Ethan realized he wasn't alone. And then, silence. The footsteps stopped. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan spun around, expecting to see a person or something worse. But the kitchen was empty. The door to the pantry was ajar, though, and it hadn't been earlier. His hands trembled as he stepped toward it, pushing the door open wider. Inside, there was nothing but empty shelves. Nothing, except for the overwhelming scent of decaying flowers and the faint outline of a handprint pressed into the dust. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. The whispers grew louder, closer, and the knocking returned. This time, it came from inside the apartment. He swore he saw movement in the shadows, shapes flickering just outside his line of sight. When dawn finally broke, Ethan packed a bag, ready to leave the cursed place behind. But as he opened his bedroom door, his heart sank. The hallway outside was no longer the familiar stretch leading to the living room. Instead, It was impossibly long, lined with identical doors on either side. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. Ethan turned back to his room, but it was gone, replaced by yet another door. His breath caught as a low guttural growl echoed from the far end of the hallway. Something was coming, and it didn't sound human. Ethan ran, his footsteps echoing unnaturally as he sprinted down the endless corridor. He tried the doors as he passed, but none would open. Behind him, the growl turned into a rasping voice, calling his name, each syllable stretched and distorted. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he didn't dare stop. Up ahead, a faint light flickered beneath one of the doors. It was the only one that looked different. Hope surged as he reached for the handle, but just as his fingers touched the cold metal, the room Ethan entered was bathed in a flickering, sickly yellow light, cast by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The air was stifling, thick with the metallic scent of rust and something sweeter, almost nauseating. The walls were lined with rows of old, mismatched picture frames, their glass cracked and fogged with grime. As Ethan cautiously stepped further in, he noticed the photographs inside the frames, blurry images of people, their faces obscured, all staring directly at the camera. Their eyes, though indistinct, seemed to follow him as he moved. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Ethan whipped around, his hand fumbling for the handle, but it was gone, replaced by a solid, featureless wall. His heart pounded as he pressed his palms against the surface, hoping for some hidden mechanism, some way out. But it was cold, unyielding. The growl he'd heard earlier was gone, replaced by an unsettling silence that pressed down on him like a weight. Suddenly, a sound broke through, the faint creak of footsteps overhead. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just above him. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The steps moved in a strange pattern, circling directly above him before stopping abruptly. Then came another sound, one that made his skin crawl, the soft scrape of fingernails scratching at the ceiling. "Who's there?" Ethan's voice cracked as he called out. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low guttural chuckle that echoed through the room. It was deep, inhuman, and filled with malice. Ethan stumbled backward, his foot catching on something soft. He looked down and recoiled in horror. A doll lay at his feet, its porcelain face cracked and stained. One of its glassy eyes was missing, and its painted lips were curled into a sinister grin. It hadn't been there when he entered. He kicked it away, his stomach churning, but as the doll slid across the floor, it left behind a streak of something dark and wet. Blood. The bulb above him flickered violently, casting the room into darkness for a brief moment before sputtering back to life. But the room was no longer empty. In the corner stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its body wrapped in tattered, blackened rags. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its bony hands were visible, clutching the edges of the fabric as if preparing to pull it back. Ethan's chest tightened, his legs trembling beneath him. "Please, I don't want any trouble," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. The only sound was the faint hum of the flickering bulb and Ethan's own ragged breathing. Then, with a sudden, unnatural jerk, the figure raised its head. The hood fell back, revealing a face, or what was left of one. Its skin was pale and stretched taut over its skull, its eyes nothing more than hollow black pits. And yet, Ethan could feel it staring directly at him. The figure began to move, its body twitching and contorting as it took a step forward. The sound of its footsteps was wet, like something dragging across a damp floor. Ethan use as a weapon. His fingers brushed against one of the picture frames, and he yanked it from the wall, hurling it at the figure. The glass shattered on impact, but the figure didn't flinch. It kept advancing, its movements growing faster, more erratic. In a blind panic, Ethan bolted toward the far end of the room, where another door had appeared. He grabbed the handle and twisted, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the figure let out a deafening shriek, a sound so piercing it felt like knives driving into his ears. He pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one came. The walls seemed to close in, the light flickering faster until the room was plunged into complete darkness. Ethan's chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, bracing for the inevitable. The room was silent again, but he could feel it. Something was standing right in front of him. He couldn't see it, but its presence was suffocating, an icy weight pressing down on his chest. Then, out of the darkness, came a voice, soft, almost tender, but layered with malice. "You shouldn't have come here." The light flickered back on, and Ethan screamed. The figure's face was inches from his own, its hollow eyes boring into him. Its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin, revealing rows of jagged, rotting teeth. Ethan threw himself to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp, and slammed his shoulder into the door with all his might. It gave way, and he tumbled into another room, slamming the door shut behind him. His relief was short-lived. This new space was larger, but far more unsettling. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in a dark, tar-like substance that dripped onto the floor. A single chair sat in the center